This is the first relational activism webinar of the year, actually, but we've been getting going with these conversations for the last 3 years, believe it or not, and myself and Rich, and also we've got Carmen and Andrew as well, who have been supporting us to hold these conversations. Yeah, it's an interesting one today, isn't it, Rich? I think we said on the flyer, on the poster, like influential people, individuals with influence, and just as we started to have a bit of a pre-webinar conflab with some of them, we were all of us were reeling a bit from how big this question is. What is the point of children's social care? But I suppose we've got people on the call that have maybe, like, in a sense, given us written answers to that question, and many of you that are tuning in will have looked at the Care Review, the national framework, Beverley's Guardian articles, and we've got Donald's book hot off the press, which we're interested to hear more about. But yeah, it's a good chance to hear between the lines. Yeah, and get a more nuanced idea of that question and where everybody's coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those questions we have to own that the question is completely stolen from Donald's work. He uses it as a kind of tool within some of his training, and it's just a really useful kind of provocative question to get us to really think about what are the fundamentals of the work that we're trying to do with children and families. Sometimes we're so caught up in the busyness of the work and what we're doing and all the requirements and the procedures that we don't have a chance to kind of step back and take this kind of maybe high level view about fundamentally what do we want to be able to achieve in our work with children and families.
Yeah, and we've been having this conversation, members of relational activism in community, mainly with parents, but also young people as well, talking about children's social care, and we've got actually some snippets of those conversations, which I wanted to start with. So these are people in community, mainly parents, talking about social work, and so maybe this gives us a bit of a context, and it feels important for us in relational activism in our position, really, in talking with the community. So yeah, so this is on social workers. So this is a parent talking. Yeah, it's easy just to go into theory mode and what we've learned, or what they've learned, but it shouldn't only be that. Social workers got to be looking at us as people, as individuals, deeper than the way you can be viewed in society. For example, yesterday I was wearing a baseball cap, trainers, ripped jeans and a jumper, and we were talking about the fact that we go into supermarkets and people, the security guards, keep following us around. So this is someone else. What I'm saying is they need to work with me to help me to get this issue sorted. They're coming to work with me, like working together is a cohesion. Yeah, it's like my mum used to say, one hand can't clap. So if you've got one hand and I'm the family, it's the other hand to help me to clap. She, the social worker, gave me a book. It's a self-help book where you can write stuff down, and it gives you like prompts and things you can fill in. And she said, I just wanted to give you this. And it's like, that's where I started to work on myself. Because it's difficult sometimes if you think when you get help, there's going to be trauma added. And it's very difficult for a lot of people to open up because there's that fear of opening up and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and open and honest without knowing the comeback from that or the consequences from that. And the final one, so social work in general shouldn't be transformational. Should be transformational, sorry. Social workers need these mindsets. They needed to walk with me, and having grown up in London, not understanding the system, I never knew what the expectations are in terms of what the laws are. And it's important to recognise that people grew up in areas, and I grew up in the streets of of London, and you don't know all of your laws and all of your rights. Yeah. So yeah, so we have I know there's a nice phrasing in the national framework about to seek, to hear, and then to respond. And maybe we could do that on a Q&A as well. So do lob your questions in as the speakers get going. That's right, isn't it, Rich?
Yeah, it's a lovely place to start. Thanks for reading those out. So maybe let's make a start with our first speaker, Chief Social Worker Isabelle Trowler. Just as a way of introducing her, I'm sure many of you don't need the introduction, but she qualified as a social worker in 1996, has worked in voluntary and statutory settings. She co-edited a book called Social Work Reclaimed in 2011 and co-founded a new model of delivering social work called Reclaiming Social Work, or sometimes referred to as the Hackney model. In 2018, she published a policy briefing with the University of Sheffield called Care Proceedings in England, the Case for Clear Blue Water, which, if you haven't already, I'd really recommend checking it out, because I think much of what is outlined in that shortish report remains as relevant today as it was in 2018. Isabelle's been in post since 2013 as the Chief Social Worker, and I feel confident that her kind of steady leadership in what has otherwise been quite a tumultuous time, both within social work and certainly across government, I think has provided a level of stability and consistency and vision for children's social work that would otherwise be lacking. She's been a catalyst for many initiatives and approaches that I think, broadly speaking, have greatly benefited our profession and, importantly, the children and families that we serve. And then finally, Isabelle was awarded a CBE in the New Year's Honour in 2024. So there's probably lots more things I could say, but I'll hand it over to you now, Isabelle, so you can so you can speak. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You can hear me okay?
Perfectly, yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. So what's the point of children's social care? Well, I think the first thing to say is that is the £12 billion question, because that's the amount of money that we spend ourselves on children's social care. And so what are we doing with all that money? I've been 30 years in this game, and only just, I think, have we managed to give some clarity about what children's social care is there to do. So it's a great question, but it is a multi-layered answer. So children's social care, I think, suffers from being too many things to too many people. And following on from Josh's review, the publication of Stable Homes Built on Love and the publication of the National Framework, I think we have got some clarity. And so those 4 outcomes in the framework, in my view, is what children's social care is there to do for the 12 billion spent. And that is to keep children with their families, first thing. That to draw in their extended family and kinship and friends networks, to help them keep their children at home, and if they can't actually live with them, to be their carers, to make sure that children in care and care leavers, if we have taken them out of their own families, that we rebuild their social networks so that they have those lifelong links that will carry them through their lives. And overarching all of that, that we have a razor-sharp focus on significant harm. And I use that term purposefully. So, as I said, we spent the 12 billion on children's social care last year, and it's almost twice now what it was when I started in my role. And we know that a shockingly disproportionate amount of that money is going on placement costs and into the private market. But we have seen a sea change, I think, in children's social care. And since 2017, we have, in most authorities, seen a really steady reduction in the numbers of children coming into care. Now, you always hear we've got more children in care than ever, which is true, but that is mainly because of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and because when children do go into care, they stay for longer. But the sector has been doing some sterling work in some parts of the country to show the way in how we can keep children with their families. And as a sector, you are having some success. That is clear, and that is fantastic. So that's primarily, for me, is the purpose of children's social care, is to keep children with their families. And that you might have seen the community care headline that I generated, not intentionally, relatively recently, where I said there should be a massive reduction in the numbers of looked after children in care as the signifier of success of the reform agenda. And I kind of mean that, you know, is that we can, I know, if we have the collective will and with the money on the table, reduce the numbers of children coming into care really substantially. We've got the second layer of purpose, and that's a broader set of outcomes which we share across agencies, so things like school attendance, supporting unaccompanied asylum seekers, crime reduction, special educational needs and disability, health and well-being, all those other desirable outcomes, but they are a shared endeavour and not specifically resting at the feet of children's social care. So we're definitely in the business of helping, and the bulk of our work should be about family help. So we've got 80,000 children, around 80,000 children in care. We've got around 50,000 children on child protection plans, but 650,000 other children who are living with their families and need some kind of support. And that might be advocacy for entitlements, advice, therapeutic or task-centered direct work, motivational or other behavioural-based interventions, changing patterns of entrenched parenting behaviours, for example, offering emotional support, coordination of services, financial help, etc. And we know that the centrality of relationships has become centre stage in the last few years, and we have seen this evolution of practice frameworks underpinned now by the national framework, articulating quite distinct principles of practice. But high quality relationships are necessary, but they're not sufficient in order to achieve things with families. And so we do need evidence, and we do need knowledge and skill if our practice is to be transformative. And it's interesting that the person that you quoted earlier used that to describe their ambition for what children's social care should be. And I think it should be transformative, and we should have that ambition for what we can do to help families. Donald's excellent book, which I know Donald will talk about a lot, The Enlightened Social Worker, is very clear in his argument that yes, we are there to help, but children's social care is also there to manage a range of tensions, and between A, the individual and the state, and B, competing rights, often within families. And not only do I completely agree with that analysis, it's why I came into social work. And the relationship between state and personal liberty is a deep interest of mine. And from when I was a 16-year-old raging anarchist, right through to a slightly more sophisticated 56-year-old. And it holds my intellectual interest to this day. And throughout those 40 years, I have made thousands and thousands of decisions about children and their families. And central to this is the balancing act between individual and private family life and state control. So my end game is always, always, always to help families stay away from the state. So the state is not necessarily benign. It's a very powerful beast, and it controls us all to some extent and has the democratic mandate to do so. But to those less powerful, and exacerbated by poverty, discrimination, disadvantage, those less powerful, the state can become a monster. So good practice in children's social care, and good social work practice in particular, because it is social work that's dominated the children's social care system for many decades, ameliorates the worst excesses of state power. And I think that that is a central function of children's social care. So we are the arbitrator, the negotiator, as well as the protector, both from abuse, but also from the state. So the more money we spend, the less cover we have. And by that, I mean, if I look over the last 30 years, that we used to do a lot of ducking and diving. And that meant that we used a whole range of methods, ploys, whatever, to achieve what we wanted for families and keep them away from the state. That's now much harder to do. And I always think about a young lad that I used to work with for quite a few years when I was a social worker. And I was always trying to keep him out of secure accommodation. And actually, from the time that I worked with him, I did manage to do that, but I'm not sure that that was what happened to him in the end. And it would be much, much harder to operate in the way that I did then now. But on balance, I think that children's social care should be transparent. We are agents of the state, and what we do as agents of the state should be known to all. So I'm an advocate of transparency in the courts, for example, and we need to show our workings out. We need to make sure that there are those checks and balances in place so that we don't abuse our own power in that process. And that's quite easy to do. So children's social care is right in the middle of this struggle between private family life, families living the lives that they want to live, and the point at which children's social care, on behalf of the state, which reflects society's expectations, says enough is enough. And the problem to date is that point is wildly inconsistent. And so much of what I hope to achieve through the reform agenda, and, you know, again, you mentioned clear blue water, but, you know, I set out that argument in that paper several years ago, is that we should have much more distance between what is significant harm and everything else, and that we end up dragging families into a very grey, murky middle ground. I think that goes against our purpose as children's social care, which is to, you know, promote the rights of families to live the way that they want to, unless it hits that threshold of significant harm. Now, even though the courts, of course, set that threshold, it's children's social care who see what's happening first. So, you know, the courts are entirely dependent on us bringing to them the families that we think have hit that threshold. I'd say that roughly 30% of care proceedings result in children either remaining or returning home. So we have some significant way to go before we understand collectively what significant harm is. So we have a lot of work underway, as you know, that the Pathfinders are testing a range of the reforms, and in particular, they're testing the separation out of the statutory child protection process. Now, that is not separating out from child protection, and there's quite a misunderstanding about this. Child protection is everywhere, but it is just about separating out some of those core statutory expectations, like the Section 47 and the care planning process. Finally, children's social care is a public administrator. So it administers public funds, and again, it's expected to spend in the way that the public would find acceptable. A very long-standing friend of mine who's been in the game for 50 years says to me often, how did we get to be the bad guy? And I just think that's such a great question, you know, because we are lambasted in many different ways. But the fact is that whoever holds the purse strings will always be mostly the bad guy. So to conclude, those 4 simple outcomes that I referenced at the beginning that are very clear in the framework is the core purpose of children's social care, but also is to manage the huge complexity of family life under state control. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Isabelle. I was just curious about, given the kind of 4 key outcomes that you'd identified, given your position in terms of being able to have a helicopter view over many different local authorities, I wondered what your sense was of like some of the social work practice strengths and maybe some of the vulnerabilities and areas for improvement that you've seen.
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, I actually am really heartened by what I see, and obviously I, you know, spend quite a lot of time out and about talking to social workers. I see a lot of casework every 2 weeks because I sit on the national panel. So I read the stories of what's happening to families and how practitioners have interacted with them all the time. So I do have a really kind of good bird's eye view, and I think that our perception of what it is that we are doing is changing. I mean, I'm talking over years. I think that we are much more practice focused. I think we are getting better at respecting families, but I do think we have some way to go. But I think that, you know, particularly recently, that when I've been out and about, practitioners are doing some fantastic work out there, really strengths-based, solution-focused, all the stuff that, you know, you would support. And yeah, so I think we're in a different position than we were 10 years ago. We have a long way to go. Families, by and large, don't like us. Maybe they never will. But for the 650,000 that we are meant to be helping, they should be talking really positively about us. You know, those that are in the child protection process, I understand, looked after children, that's hard when we've torn their family apart. I understand that. But for the 650,000, which probably equates to about, I don't know, 500,000 families, they should be, you know, waxing lyrical about our general helpfulness and brilliance. That should be the ambition.
Yeah, I wonder with some of the practice-related issues, whether that reflects an inarticulation in some sense of what the fundamental role and some of the challenges that social workers are expecting to navigate. Like you mentioned, a lot of parents don't want to necessarily work with us. They're quite fearful and anxious about our involvement, and we're not necessarily equipped or trained always to deal with some of those conflicts and some of the challenges that they bring. And that's partly why I'm very pleased to see Donald's book articulate so brilliantly some of those issues.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, let me bring a question in from the attendees here. So this is from Lewis Chaff. Thanks for the question, or from Lois rather. So there are high levels of poverty and destitution in England. What does Isabelle think is the impact of this in supporting children to remain with their families? And what should the government, social workers and society as a whole do to tackle this?
Yeah, well, reduce child poverty, full stop. You know, how you do that, I don't have the answers to that, but absolutely that is what we should be aiming to do. There is obviously a really clear relationship between poverty and involvement in children's social care, not always, but most often. I suppose my view is that we have got very mixed up in our thinking about what is neglect and what is families bringing up children in poor communities. And our expectations of what families can do and how they can operate within the social context that they live can be wildly out of kilter to what is possible. So yeah, so I think there's quite a lot of work to do in that. I think we've the idea that this is a kind of new territory is not so. That throughout the whole of my career, we have only ever really worked with families that are living in poverty. There may be more of them now, although actually the numbers that we're working with in children's social care isn't significantly different. But we know the impact of poverty, relationship to family stress, and then how that then can start to fracture family relationships in various ways.
Thank you. And
can I make a comment on that, Tim? Is that okay?
Please,
just to say that thank you for that, Isabelle. But it's obviously a major question when we look at the key outcomes you're wanting from the reform process, which is children remaining with families, of children remaining with extended or social networks, because we know the statistics are those families are living in poverty. So the two things go together, delivering the great outcome that we want, which is keeping families together, because we know that that is a big ameliorator in terms of separation. But we've got to at the same time have a social policy, an economic policy that focuses on tackling child poverty or families in poverty. Otherwise, we'll end up in a terrible cycle of those families being too stressed and breaking down, and then the whole thing collapsing and reversing.
That's right.
It's really important that we have these tranches going on at the same time while we do this really important form around the social.
I mean, I think the only observation I'd make about that is that we don't want to forget that through practitioner efforts in the current social and financial climate, we have seen significant increase in the decrease in the numbers of new entrants coming into care, new children. So that they despite of that context, they are able to do. There are ways you can do it. It's a lot about judgment call.
Yes,
and I really, your level of tolerance is, I suppose.
Yeah, and I really recognise that, but also what we also recognise is I have to say this because obviously I'm going to declare that I'm a trustee of kinship. We obviously have our kinship carers telling us that they're under tremendous pressure and strain because of the context, and we're very lucky, that we have family members who are holding on, sometimes in real desperate circumstances, and a system at the moment that doesn't really yet address some of the fundamental questions about keeping children thriving in those families.
Absolutely.
Doing well in those families.
Yeah.
I will just I'll just ask one final question. I know this is from a parent, Tracy, who's a regular at our webinar. So, and this might be to Isabelle or somebody else might want to take this one on. So Tracy asks, what training do social workers receive on the bond between mothers and their children? More harm happens to children when this bond is broken rather than supporting families.
Yeah, so I mean, I could say a little about that, and then Donald might want to, as the academic amongst us.
That's a good idea.
So probably not enough would be my view, and that I think that we should have so social work is a generic qualification, initial qualification, as you know, so that limits the amount of depth that you can put into any area. We have more specialist qualification routes, which probably have a greater focus on that. But I think in the post-qualification arena, we should have some very clear standards, which obviously we hope to have in the early career framework, which is setting out exactly that, so that there's a really strong focus on child development and how you can maximize a child's positive development through parenting.
Yeah, I mean, I think social workers are taught on their courses and after their courses about attachment and family relationships. I guess they're also taught about abuse and neglect and things that can go wrong. And then they have to make very difficult judgments, which I'll be talking about. But I think ultimately what's really important is a set of values, which Isabelle has articulated, about how we should be supporting family life as much as we can, and only taking action when we absolutely have to. And I think that has, for various reasons, it shifted, but I think it is beginning to shift back again. But yeah, I guess that's what I would say in relation to that particular point.
Thank you.
I think it's a general kind of truism in social work that once you've done it for a few years and you've been involved in the removal of a child, that the experience has such a profound effect on you that you become very apprehensive and wary of pursuing that course of action. And so that speaks to something about how do we retain a level of practice with wisdom within our system. And with the current issues around retention and recruitment, that's possibly a concern where you don't have many experienced social workers. But I think it's probably a topic for another webinar, because I feel like it's such an important one that we could speak to quite a lot.
Thank you for the question, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll move on to our next speaker, Josh MacAlister. I'm sure many of you, like Isabelle, are familiar with Josh. Former teacher, founded Frontline in 2013. Is that right? If I wrote the date wrong. No, 2013, and led the charity, I think, with phenomenal success before chairing the independent review. For me, I was very impressed with the scope, the depth, and the recommendations that came out of the care review. Especially with its emphasis on love and care and relationships. And I think whatever your thoughts are about the care review, there's no denying that Josh put forward an extremely ambitious vision and roadmap for children's social care. Currently, he's the executive chair for Foundations, previously the What Works Centre, and they've just put forward a really exciting and ambitious plan called the REACH plan, which is looking at how do we support victims of domestic abuse, and it has the potential to position England as kind of global leaders in how we support children and victims of domestic abuse. It kind of has all of the hallmarks, I think, of Josh's approach to all of the work that he's done. It's bold, it's ambitious, and kind of underpinned by this like relentless striving for excellence. He's also the co-founder of Shift and a Labour parliamentary candidate. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Josh. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Rich. And I'm finding that when you slip that in at the end about being a candidate, then all the questions are about that as well. So we'll see what comes back. But great to be on this call with such a group of kindred spirits. And I've had a quick look through the attendee list as well. Lots of people on the panel, but also in the audience who were very influential on the review's thinking and my own thinking, having been in this space for 11 or 12 years or so now. The question that we're trying to discuss today is one of the questions that the review published 3 months into the review process itself. So we started the review and then within 3 months published the case for change. And one of the initial problems we sought to draw some attention to and ask a question about was, what is the purpose of children's social care? And for two main reasons, really. One was it was fairly opaque. We looked through lots of statutory guidance and legislation, and whilst there were moments where there was clarity provided, it was then immediately undone by further iterations of a version of what children's social care should be about, what it should be measured on, how it should be working with different agencies. So it's been a sort of ebb and flow of clarity, moving generally away from clarity and towards opacity. So that was one. And then the second reason why the question was being asked was the blurriness between different agencies and service responsibilities. And of course, there is a truth in the fact that the work that children's social care is trying to do is a joint effort with other agencies and services. But that shouldn't detract from the fact that there should be a core set of responsibilities and accountability for children's social care that is really clear to everybody in the system and the public who should have some expectations of it. So we asked the question. We then got hundreds of responses back during that stage of the review. And actually, again, you can go back and look at what was published of those responses. There wasn't a huge amount of consensus on what the purpose should be. People kind of found it quite easy to get into the immediate substance of, well, social workers should do this. Mm-hmm. But when it came to a global view of what is the purpose of the system, it often wasn't so clear. And I think as we went through as I sort of personally went through the review process and the conversations that were most influential on me from family members, children who'd had, a whole lifetime of interaction with this system, the conclusion I got to, which was published on page 20 of the final report, was that the purpose should be to enable children to grow up in loving, safe, stable families, and that where that's not possible, that the care system should provide those same foundations. And I think that a version of that conclusion is now embodied in the statutory guidance that is the new framework that the government have set out with some outcomes. And I welcome that, because it has sought to translate that process of listening and clarity into some usable framework, albeit in slightly different language. The paragraph that followed that in the review, and this was linked to discussions that would be quite circular about how the system balances family and child rights, was influenced in some part by conversations with Donald about rights at the time, because I think, Donald, you were, as the review was happening, were in a intellectual exercise over rights and family rights and the children's social care system. The paragraph that followed it stated that realizing families' rights was most often the surest way to realize children's rights. And so it was really an attempt to frame that, rather than it often being a conflict between the two, it was that the pursuit of the rights of families was the surest way to realize children's rights in the main. Mm-hmm. And that feels quite profound, because I don't think that's how the system operates. It doesn't often enough see the family unit as the mechanism of change, of being the mechanism of greatest interest. And the thing that children's social care has as a focus, which I think you could argue is fairly unique, maybe completely unique, is that it is the service that should be interested in and see its mechanism of change as being the family. And it was that led me to consider, although I never recommended it, that we should replace children's social care as language with family help or family health, a family health service, and whether that would change some of the behavior in the system. And I ended up concluding that it was a bit of a, renaming things, doesn't often result in huge change, but something about the concept of a service that's interested in the health of families who are struggling and tending to the health of that family unit as being the best way of realizing children's rights. So that encapsulates in lots of ways my own view about where the system should be and where it is at the moment. There was quite a lot of pushback to that, and I think there still is institutionally within the system. And Isabelle sort of touched on this, that when the review recommended that a family engagement score should be collected and published across the system on a routine basis, a bit like NHS satisfaction figures, which we can all see, and they get published transparently everywhere, and we can see the differences between different parts of the system. From even quite important national actors that inspect and regulate said system, the view was, well, of course families won't like children's social care. The response will be negative. And because we're giving families a hard time, we're sort of, we're getting into that child protection significant harm space. And I think that goes to show how far the gap really is between a system, if it is based on helping families realise their rights as a pursuit of children's rights being realised, that actually for the 500,000 families who should be receiving the Section 17 spirit help, which is children who are at risk of not reaching a reasonable level of health and development, families who are struggling to raise their kids in conditions of adversity, not causing significant harm. These are families that need help. For those families, the system should be helpful. It should get alongside them, help them achieve what they want to for their children. And we should not be afraid of a system that holds itself to account on the experience that families have of that interaction. And also that should be not waiting for referrals to come in, but seeking those families out and getting alongside them and asking, how can we help? Putting the services where those families are, doing things in all kinds of ways which reduce the stigma and barriers to interaction. And again, you know, the curious thing looking back on the last 10, 15 years of policy development was that we created this new category of targeted early help because we believed that Section 17 as a framework wasn't working. So the social work, the core children's social care bit of help wasn't meeting its function. And so we created a new category before it with new thresholds and referral pathways and barriers to entry. And that was built on early help. And so we had these three categories with everyone kind of managing resources and demand across thresholds. And that was a crazy place to get to. So to go back to the incredibly well-drafted language of the 89 Act, when it comes to Section 17, we look at a population in an area and ask doctors, teachers, other practitioners, who are the families who've got children who are at risk of not reaching a reasonable level of health and development, and what's the service we can provide to the family to assist them with that. And that is, you know, that should be the population. And I think we could get to over time with some of the reforms, you know, delivered at pace and with the resources necessary, we can get to a family help system that meets that need at a large scale and shifts billions of pounds of spending within the 12 billion that Isabelle mentioned, so that you know, that becomes the focus. So that's my sort of overall view on purpose and some reflections about challenges within the system in shifting in that direction. I think it's also worth just one final point on the care system. So we talk, I think, rather too loosely about the importance of relationships. And one of the things that came out for me in the review, again, from lots of interactions with young people in care, was that the obsession of the care system was more driven by the anxiety of adults running it than it was by the need to prioritize not just relationships for those in care, but actually and specifically building organic and enduring networks for those young people. And we can, you know, at the moment, as of today, we are running a care system which is assuring itself of safety based on a set of metrics that bear no resemblance to what it actually means to have a safe life as someone leaving care. You can leave care lonely and alone, having been contained by a system that's done its job. And there is I think, still fairly fundamental mismatch there between a £6-7 billion care system and what it is we know through so much evidence young people need to succeed and have a good life, which is people who love them, connection, not with professionals, or some of them might end up having been professionals, but with their own network who claim them as part of their tribe. And we are still some way, you know, quite a considerable way from where we are today in the care system in those relationships to where we need it to be. And I think the framework helps expose that gap. We need to do a lot more exposing of that gap, and we need to help one another, you know, whether it's fostering teams, adoption teams, kinship support, the child protection system, the court system, really navigate through a very profound shift from where we are now to where we need to be, which is a care system that is obsessed with creating those enduring bonds and relationships.
Thank you, Josh. I really like that point about the system balancing child and family rights, and how if you realise the kind of family's rights, that would be the surest way of upholding the child's rights. There's definitely been in my time this kind of fluctuation between a focus on supporting and helping parents, and then there'll be an inquiry into the death of the child, where perhaps the social workers have been or alleged to have been quite naive in terms of the parents' capacity to change, and the child was unduly harmed or even killed. And then there's a preoccupation with being solely focused on the child, and so there's kind of this fluctuation, this alternation between being very focused on the parents, then focused on the child. But actually, I suppose what we're trying to point towards is accommodating both the parent and the child as a kind of family unit, and managing those tensions.
And I think that two things struck me, which absolutely speak to that point and are exhibits of how this plays out in public discourse. When the review was being undertaken, there were two high-profile child deaths that triggered the national panel review. Features of both, which were actually, I think, actually features across the whole system. One was of a child protection system which is completely overheated and is far less accurate than it was 10 years ago. So we are investigating tens and tens of thousands of more families for significant harm and not finding much more significant harm. And it's a less accurate system for it. So if we believe the route to safety is mass investigation, it's not working. And maybe it's less safe to do that, because actually every interaction which hasn't found significant harm has drained resources away from a system that could build that relationship and be helpful, and perhaps uncover some significant harm in that process. I remember when we set up Frontline, Donald was very keen on building motivational interviewing into the program, and the first teaching of motivational interviewing on the first cohort of Frontline, listening to parents through the recordings that we used in the teaching, and stuck with me was, you know, if you can have an open conversation and people feel confident in sharing, and that there might be some help provided, they might be more honest about the risks that are being posed to their children, and that stuck with me. So we've got an inspector that's not called out the massive problems we have with a overheated child protection system. So that's one example, Rich, of that exact element. And then the second one was that in both Star Hobson and Arthur Lavignio Hughes's stories, there were family members saying we're worried. It wasn't, you know, we're not just talking here about parents. There were family members on the scene who we weren't engaging with. So this idea of realizing families' rights, I think it holds on both the dynamic and behavior of the child protection system as being perhaps not getting us to the addressing of significant harm that we need, and on where there might be abuse within a family. Actually, the family might be, you know, might have a more accurate picture and an assessment of that harm than professionals who don't see the kids very often. So I think it holds as a concept, but we need to be able to have that discussion when these things hit the headlines and be able to get into it, you know, on the airwaves in a way that helps the public understand that process.
Josh, we've got a question. Thank you. We've got a question here on the Q&A, and this is from Joanne Dempster. Thanks, Joanne. So she says, as a practice leader, the situation with the provision of care for children and the sufficiency of options for those children who do come into care is so troubling. Do you think there's a possibility of our regulator building in controls for registered children's homes to sign up to standard commissioning rates as a condition of their registration?
Yeah, so this was an area that the review, I mean, I spent so much time in this space of commissioning and building capacity in the care system, and the recommendations in the review focused on ramping up, well, shifting the focus of the system over time so that we had more and more help and resource find its way into family networks, so that more children could be held within those family networks in the first place. I believe that we've got, this morning, waking up in foster homes, many children who could be living in family networks, were the support there in the family network system. So that's family group conferencing for more families that lead to new family network plans that finance teams in local authorities have got the confidence to back and resource as an alternative to care. Even quite conservative estimates would see thousands of children move out of the care system and be supported in family networks. And the projections the review made would see £600 million shift out of the care system and into kinship financial support packages. So that, that would make a considerable difference. For foster care, some of the things we've done as a country in other related fields show how many odd obstacles we have to ramping up fostering capacity and the variety of fostering that's needed for children who could live seeing relatives more often with some shared care, or foster carers who can meet the specific needs of maybe only one child or set of siblings at a time. But I think last year we only approved just over 2,000 new foster carers. Yet the Homes for Ukraine scheme in a year, and that system didn't exist before it was created, approved 100,000 families in 1 year. Imagine what would be possible if we'd approved 10,000 foster carers last year. I'm not suggesting we do 100,000, but we approved 10,000 great families who could open up their houses and their hearts and make space in their life to love a kid and maybe be involved in that family network for the next 10, 20 years. How different would our care system be? Can we do that as a country? Can we recruit 10,000 foster carers next year? Absolutely. We absolutely can. So there's a scale of ambition problem there. And then the third one is around residential care. 1 in 3 children in residential care in England have on their care plan that they should be in a foster home. 1 in 3. And I've met those children. I went into these bungalow care homes that have got very little purpose other than for containment. And there were children who told me, I don't want to be here. And they've been sort of left languishing in residential care as a form of containment. So we need to do all of that. Now that reduces huge amounts of demand on the residential care system. And then, I'm not saying we wait for that, but then what is also needed is a reimagining of the purpose of residential care. It should be used as a route and a process of healing to get back into a family network of some form. That, I believe, should be its purpose. That means we need very different types of residential care. And there's pockets of that we can see within the system, the Lighthouse model, Juno, Mulberry Bush. There's some really good residential models. They're not the main stock of residential care. And so we could tinker with a commissioning reform which sees us more efficiently buy stuff that doesn't work for children. Or we could build a system that over time shifts where children are living so they're closer to homes and families, and allows us to create really bespoke specialist forms of residential care that are a route back to family life for children. And that's why, much to the frustration of some local authority leaders, I'm convinced that requires regional care cooperatives. I think individual councils by themselves just don't have the bandwidth and the capacities to do that.
How do you deal with the problem of the private equity problem we've got? The equity problem, which is huge.
You can't do it whilst you've got huge demand.
Yeah.
You just can't. So the best way to do it, and you do need to deal with it, is to get control of the system.
Yeah.
It's out of control because there's far more demand than there is supply.
Yeah.
So that needs to change. And the quickest way to do that, let's recruit 10,000 foster carers. We would move 3,000, you know, within a year or two, be able to move thousands of children out of residential care and into foster homes, and immediately be in a position where we can have a calmer, more rational and balanced relationship between those who want to provide homes for these kids and local authorities. And that gives you the chance then to deal with profit making, and then shift to a more locally led and controlled system.
Thank you. And let's segue into to hearing from you, Beverley. Thanks very much to Josh. I'm feeling the tension actually of you know, you set up a process and then, where in theory everybody has a right to access.
Yeah, and you got half hour left.
And then you try and administrate it. And I feel for everybody that's asked such good pertinent questions that we're not able to get around to them all. Those panelists have got access to the questions, so if you can navigate the technology and you want to weigh in on some of these, then do. But we wanted to come to Beverley Barnett Jones, MBE, an associate director at the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and a member of the Royal.
Don't forget the doctor.
Yeah, no, I was coming to that, because I was going to say that actually coming to the Queen Mary University and seeing you receive your honorary doctorate was really sensational, and what you said that day was really a very compelling testimony or answer to the question, what's the point of children's social care? Because in your inimitable style, Beverley, you brought in your experiences, and both lived and learned, and really said a lot with passion about social care on that occasion. And I think your long career and the reason why you have been recognised, when we could pull out the drug and alcohol court as an example. But how do you? I think I alluded to it earlier when we first came on the call and were talking. You were one of those that was saying, "Wow, this is it's a big how's it sitting with you now?"
It's been so wonderful to listen to the previous contributors, because actually it's made what I'm going to say shorter, because not to claim that I'm as great as the brilliant and the great and the leaders there, but some of what's been said, I was going to try and say, well, you know, team, come on, let's, you know, so in that sense, you get me, it's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed the contributions. Isabelle's really, I just love Isabelle on the stage. I've always loved her on the stage. And it was interesting to hear her sort of really put out that kind of framework again. And Josh, you know, just your contribution was so helpful, and the continued thinking and effort you're putting in here, you know, and whatever happens with your parliamentary career, you know, if we can get the politics right, we can get it right for the children, you know, which is simply, that's how it works. I don't know that. So I was going to start with a little story. I don't know, some people might have come to what I did last week, but I wrote a story. So we're going to start with a story. So it's a somewhat different contribution, largely because I kind of knew, in a sense, you were going to get all this great stuff to get me, you know, from people, because that's like that's the centre of what they've been about all of these years. So I'm going to start with a story about Marcus, Elijah and Sandra. So Marcus is 8. He lives at home with his birth parents, Sandra and Elijah. Both his parents work in the professions. Marcus is their only child. The 3-bedroom house is privately owned. They live in the same area they grew up in. It's changed a lot since they were young. They have good family and friends, and their lives with Marcus is peaceful. They both value the importance of education and respect for elders, and go to church on a Sunday. No one in their family has ever been involved with the police or social services. When Marcus turned 11 and changed school, Sandra was anxious, as he was a shy boy and lived inside himself. Within a year, Sandra's worries began to grow. She noticed a change in Marcus's behaviour. He seemed short-tempered and was getting upset about things, not wanting to go out and play with old friends like in the past. His mum and dad tried to speak to him, but he told them things were okay and there was nothing to worry about. She tried to speak with his teachers, but they advised her that Marcus was fine and was a good kid doing well, and he was the least of their worries. Marcus still worried his mum and dad, but friends who had old children said it's probably just growing pains. Whilst at work, Sandra received an emergency call from the school requesting that she and her husband attend to pick up Marcus. They would not explain why. When they arrived, they saw police cars at the school gate. The head of year approached them, telling them that Marcus had been arrested for ABH. He had brought a knife into school and, unprovoked, stabbed the teacher in her forearm. Neither Sandra nor Elijah could believe this and denied it was their son. When calmer, they approached the police car where Marcus was sitting in the back. He was in tears. The police officer spoke to Sandra and explained that he was under arrest, likely to be charged, but could return to parental care that night. While speaking to Sandra, the police officer referred to her boyfriend and asked if Elijah was the father. When she corrected him, he seemed surprised, but suggested that to keep the situation calm, it was probably best only she came to the station with her son. Elijah refused, protesting that it wasn't like the bad old days where police could get away with treating a black man like this. The police officer objected to this expression and advised that he would arrest Elijah for breaching the peace if he did not refrain from commenting. He then advised Elijah and Sandra that social care would be referred to and they would be accepted from them the next day. Just wanted you to hold on to, it's a made up story. It's not based on any case that I'm aware of, but just to hold on to what's the point of children's social care and think about families' experiences and how they may first encounter that system, the places where they come from, how they encounter it. So just to start, when Tim asked me to join this session today, I have to say I got a little bit triggered. This is because it was a bit of an automatic response in me, and it went to my feelings and emotions rather than to my head. I went to that place of years of exasperation and frustration, and as I think Isabelle talked about, calculative practices to manage the system and to achieve what I thought would be, with families, the best for them. But also as a person of lived experience who suffered some of the failings of the system, and a practitioner who really wants social care to work well with and for the people. So after that sort of visceral moment, I sort of left it and didn't go back to it, and then decided I was going to just go and talk to lots of different people about what did they think the point of children's social care was. Over the time I've known Tim, we've had lots of conversations about this, but I thought I'm just going to go and speak to other people. I spoke to people that are professionals in the business, the lawyers and social workers that I know. I also spoke to family members, and I also spoke to friends who aren't involved in children's social care at all and haven't been able to ever understand why would people do it. You know, why will people do social care? Why would people want to be there? They just can't understand the world. So I spent the last month just asking these questions, and then I kind of reflected over a bit of a difficult weekend this weekend, but I reflected on what people have said to me. So I was going to share a bit of those headlines, because I think what came out for me, I'm going to go to the conclusion in a sense, but I'll share with you afterwards, but what came out to me is that, you know, we're really deeply embedded in these narratives about children's social care. And, you know, we moved to children's social work, and then Isabelle made a statement about it being primarily about a social work activity. We recognise, you know, that there's a legitimacy problem. You know, there's been a kind of accountability problem. There's been like a transparency problem. But after these kind of chats I've had with people, it kind of struck me that, you know, the whole issue of the authority recognition and the legitimacy and the sustainability of a society's willingness to keep supporting this state intervention, this social care intervention, is at risk. because people pay for this state intervention, and the people that pay for it is everybody. And most of those everybody's aren't involved in the system, aren't encountering the state, but they are having to pay their taxes. And so there's an importance of, although we speak to ourselves and we spent a long time on reform, you know, Isabelle's been in reform, Josh has led the big reform, and we spoke to lots of people who encounter the system. The importance of speaking to people who don't encounter the system and talking about what it is that we are doing, how we do it, why we do it. It just struck me from the response I got that maybe we're not doing that enough, and we really need to turn our minds to that, because, you know, we have a legitimacy crisis, because people who fed back to me were basically saying, well, you're supposed to protect children, but you don't, do you? You know, because of the headline news is that we're failing. Yeah. The idea that, oh, well, children in care, very negative responses I got. This was like my network of people that are friends gave me negative responses about kids in care. There must be something going on with them. So there was this kind of line of like, this kind of thing emerged, which was like the sort of altruism, you know, the sort of idea we have that we're a caring and loving society. There's a lot of negative context out there for the families and the children that we're actually here to support and work with. And I just thought we haven't told our story well enough about what we're doing. We haven't communicated well enough to people about why it's an essential activity as part of a civilizing, just and fair society. Now, it might sound a bit grand, but actually that's the context we're in. We can get into the details that all my colleagues have shared with us before, but I just thought that really struck me. But what was interesting was it ranged from that sort of negative kind of sense of, oh, you're failing and you're spending people's money, and people can't sort themselves out, pull themselves up by their bootstrap kind of approach, to people who talked about the importance of care being love, you know, and that it should be about love in people's lives. It should be about attending to people's well-being. You know, it should be those kind of noble actions, you know, that kind of noble kind of sense of what the purpose of children's social care should be. It should really be in the community, and that came over quite strongly, that it should be a community-based activity. It should be about looking and bringing together the strengths of communities and families, and not necessarily an agenda which is about the state or the professionals leading it, but it should be about how do you look at the strengths that are in people's communities and in their families. And that, in a sense, it's part of a whole ecosystem about care and love, you know, and whether the resources are being used appropriately to strengthen family and community. I think that I just want to reflect a bit on that family rights versus children stuff, because that is nonsense. It's a dangerous binaries that we always fall into, you know, the oppositional positions that we take, because you can't have one without the other, because children live in the system of the family, families in an ecosystem of its community. So when we think about family, parent and child, Richard, we always have to think social context, social system and community, because every day you're experiencing interactions that impact on your functioning. And we know that the evidence is there in all sorts of different types of research that tells us that. So I had people sort of tell me that, well, you know, it should be about protecting children. It should be about a sort of safety net. It should be about an economic activity, which was quite interesting. Somebody said to me that actually it should be about social mobility. So it should be about providing interventions that lift families up, lift children up, so they are socially mobile. I mean, that's a grand ambition, you know. Certainly people talked about the importance of ensuring that it provided dignity and respect to those who are involved in encountering it. There's also a real focus on it should be practical. So children's social care should focus on practical things that can help families. It should be advocating for families, helping them to navigate the various systems that they encounter in their lives, the health systems or the benefit systems or the housing systems. It certainly didn't restrict itself to a sense that there are this sort of simple set of functions that it has, that it spoke to me to something bigger around it being the glue, the glue that says that a society that is a functioning and an open society is one that really recognises that you deliver and you help people and you offer that help to people as a part of a statement of, a bit like how people still, despite the criticism of NHS, they still hold on the idea that you're there from the cradle to the grave. So the idea that you have a bigger function than maybe the activities. And the other side of it is, can the activities really be delivered in the way it's currently structured? I'm just going to say 1 minute on that, which is, my view is I've always believed that we should be shifting it out of where it is back into communities and creating communities of care to deliver a lot of those services, especially for that 650,000 that we talk about, and that's what I would like to see. I would like to see a big shift there into strengthening communities and community activity and professionals, being part of that, but not necessarily driving it and leading it. That's all I have to say.
Well, I did want to, and we can, what you're saying about the felt legitimacy in community of children's social care, I think will really resonate with what Donald's going to bring around.
Oh, okay, because Donald, I haven't had a chance to see your book yet.
But one before we move to Donald, so somebody's speaking directly to you here.
Yeah, okay.
In the question and answer. So this is Millie. So I'm a second-year social work student who began this journey because I felt my lived experiences and the emotional intelligence I have gained through those difficulties creates a space of authenticity and humanity, which seems to help people to be open and honest with me. I wanted to use this power for something good. I have since found that the restrictions of professionalism, I cannot talk freely, and I'm feeling as though I'm losing my own autonomy because I'm trying to be the professional we are taught to be, which means I can't be me. Why can't we just be human and tap into our use of self without the restriction of professionalism? It seems to create more barriers in a world where barriers are all service users see.
Man, that goes so deep, Billy. Thank you for that. That goes so deep. And I think Isabelle and me could say there are places you could go to where you can be you and you can be authentic and use those as your strength in your practice, as well as the professional knowledge that you have that can help families and help people. So I think there is please stay with the hope there, because there are spaces where you can be your authentic self, and in fact that is one of the most effective ways of engaging and building relationships.
The enlightened social worker is hoving into.
And I say York, I'm going to shout out York and Martin just on that.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is Donald's book. I think many of you know that Donald's a professor of children and family social work and director of Cascade. And big up to Cascade. Carmen, a relational activist, works in Cascade, and she helps to organise these webinars. And I know that Cascade is a home for lots of people with lived experience that are doing research and doing good work. So Donald, I've heard you talk about the reality gap. And so this theme of, what's the felt legitimacy for social care in the community, and what should we be doing as a state? But you set it off how you want to get going on the themes of the book.
Thank you, and these have been fantastic talks. I just wish we had longer to sort of engage in a real discussion. I'm kind of lost in admiration, particularly people who are engaging all the sort of detailed work and to create policy change, and hearing the voices of lived experience from all of you, the different people you've come across. I think I'm probably going to, at least initially, talk at a slightly higher level. I have the good fortune as an academic to be traveling around a fair bit. So I've spoken about this issue in not just England, but several countries, 5 or 6 different European countries in America. And I guess they all have many of the same tensions and difficulties we're talking about. There are some that are unique to the UK, but actually a lot of these difficulties are not, I think, just about England or the UK. And so I'd like to talk at a slightly higher level about some of the the issues. And it's kind of interesting that we're even having this discussion, isn't it? Because I don't think you'd have a bunch of doctors or teachers or maybe even police officers saying, what is the purpose of our service? And yet we can legitimately get together and go, what are we trying to achieve here? And certainly on a personal level, I think I was kind of wrong about the purpose of children's social care for about just 25 years or so of practicing. I came in, I think, as most social workers do, to help people. I initially kind of helped families because parents kind of presented the most. Part of learning to be a professional social worker was then being able to focus on the child. Then what I hope I got to is some sense that I was trying to help children and families and parents and trying to balance all those different competing needs and voices. But I think more recently I've begun to think that focus on helping, there's certainly more to it than that. And I guess 3 sets of experiences shaped that. And one is, I'm afraid, if the purpose of children's social care is to help people and therefore to produce better outcomes, I don't think there's very good evidence that we're very good at it. In fact, I'd go further. There's quite a lot of evidence that we're not good at it. If outcomes is the purpose, the outcomes are not great. Secondly, when I reflect on my own practice, but also listening to recordings of practice of social workers and across different studies, we've done about 800 recordings of practice in 10 or 12 local authorities. So a pretty substantial sample. I mean, all sorts of different, as you might expect across that size of sample, all sorts of different types of conversation. But I would say tension and conflict, at least a low level and sometimes a high level, is a consistent feature of those conversations. And if we're here to help, why are the conversations so difficult? Why are they so kind of tense? And why aren't people just going, thank you for being here to empower me? I want to be, how can you help me and my family? Which kind of picks up on issues raised by everyone so far. And then third, related to that, I think one of the huge improvements we've seen in practice in the last 10, 15 years is the development of practice frameworks. For those who are newer to social work, it may come as a surprise that when people like myself and Isabelle and others entered practice in the 1990s, we didn't have practice frameworks. We just got on with it. There was no sense that the local authority had a way of working and a way of supporting that. But there's a problem. A lot of the practice frameworks have been developed essentially from therapeutic settings. So I've been involved with motivational interviewing and systemic practice in particular. And the problem is you train social workers these skills and then they either say it to you or they just think it. That's fine. But then when I've got a really difficult conversation, how on earth do I raise my concerns about this child and say this child, not being fed. My concern is that you're drinking too much and not feeding this child properly. That's fine, but I'm not, this isn't a counselling conversation. How do we bring those into a different sort of, how do we bring those types of skills and maybe even more importantly, values into a different type of conversation? So those 3 sets of experiences, listening to recordings of practice, thinking about outcomes, and then thinking about how practice frameworks could be useful for children's social care, have contributed to me thinking, well, how can we conceptualize it? If it's more than helping, or it's helping plus something else, what's going on? And it was partly discussions about family group conferences and how to evaluate them that helped me think differently, because some people said family group conferences should be a right, which I agree, and they therefore can't be evaluated, which I don't think is a particularly strong argument. But it made me think, well, lots of what we do is essentially a right. And actually, when you begin to look at it, it's almost all about rights. And in particular, social workers and children's social care are involved when rights are in potential or actual conflict or tension. And I don't think that's just a UK-wide thing. That's, as far as I can see, every liberal democracy has these issues. And I just want to sort of, in the 6-7 minutes I've got left, outline a couple of those sort of higher level tensions. The most obvious one is, as a liberal democracy, we have a principle called the harm principle. All Western countries do, certainly. Most countries in the world now do, well, many countries in the world now do, which is essentially, you should be free to do what you like, so long as you're not hurting somebody else, which I think is a pretty good principle, but it has a couple of problems. And one of the problems is what if you can't exercise your freedom? And an obvious group who can't exercise their freedom are children. Until recently, we just assumed that families wanted the best for them, usually fathers actually, and just assumed that they would look after their children's rights. And in more recent decades, we've realized that with abuse and neglect, or some families can't or don't meet their children's rights. That creates a whole series of dilemmas: the right to protection, the right to family life. Essentially, at core, a bit as Isabelle said, we want a society that allows a high level of freedom for parents to parent as they want, but within limits. And it's the limits that lead to a lot of the more child protection type activity. Second, so that's sort of about protection. It's about rights, but particularly rights that may be in conflict and that need to be handled very carefully. And that's true at every level. So it's about, I think a child protection investigation is quite a major intervention in family life. And in my opinion, we're not treating it with sufficient seriousness. As such, we should have a legitimate reason, a legitimate level of concern about what's going on for a child to overrule the family's right to privacy. And it goes on through sort of every type of intervention we make. It's not just about removing children, it's about every unasked for intervention in family life. Then we have issues about providing for need and for services. And here there are tensions between what people say they need, what we as professionals can recognize they need, and then often what the resources that will actually be provided are. And I think, again, we need professionals who can work with these different visions of what is needed and what's helpful, and can often lobby services, children's services, other services for the needs of families and others. But I think those tensions are irreducible, both in relation to protection and in relation to helping families. And they're the reason we need thoughtful, kind, wise professionals and organizations that support people such as that. And then the final thing is, if we think it's about rights, then, or that it's substantially about rights, then the process is the purpose. So it's not just about outcomes. The actual process of working with people is important in its own right. For instance, if after this session I get a knock on the door from a social worker doing a child protection investigation on my family, I don't think they should be judged just by the outcomes they might produce or not produce, because I don't think very good social work would change the outcomes personally. I think the process is also important. The way they respectfully treat me, genuinely listen to my point of view, being clear about what the concerns are, creating a dialogue around those, that is important in its own right. In the same way that if we were going to judge the effectiveness of courts or the police service, we don't focus just on outcomes. And I think that has implications for certainly for how we research services, how we think about judging whether they're working or not. It's not just about improving outcomes. The process is important in its own right. But that also therefore has implications for leadership, how we lead services, where it can be difficult to know what the aim of the service is, and for practitioners, where I hope we can begin to understand why social work is so full of tension and difficulty. But the final point I want to make, and I've gone as quickly as I can, and I think I will finish on time. The final point I want to make is I think a rights-focused approach is really useful for understanding the nature of the work, because it goes beyond a kind of counselling type of approach to things, to think about how we work with conflict and tension. I think it's the most effective way of, but because the process is the purpose, I think approach that is compassionate, caring, I think a kind of loving is central, because we don't want just rights delivered as if we were a court. We want a caring society, and working with rights in a caring way, I think, is fundamental to children's social care. I think this vision shows that good children's social care is not just about helping individuals. It's about creating the sort of society, the beloved community that we can all be part of, I hope. And I hope it can provide a vision for social workers that simultaneously, on the one hand, explains why the work is so difficult, so fraught with tension, but on the other hand, emphasizes why it's so important for people who may be struggling, but so important for society, that we have individuals, professionals, and organizations who are dedicated to helping people who are having the most difficulties in society in ways that are thoughtful, wise, kind, but authoritative. So I sort of rushed through it because I know we didn't have much time. I hope that's given a sense of what I'm talking about. It's kind of a higher level way of looking at things, which I hope has a lot of sort of resonance or similarities to some of the things other people have been saying.
Yeah, thank you so much, Donald, and yeah, sincere apologies for we owe you 5 minutes. That's my fault. We've got a question here to give a chance to the contributors on the Q&A. So Rachel Honeyford says, I wonder if we could attend more to the idea that talking about risk or naming problems is somehow not therapeutic. What might be your response to that?
I'm not quite sure what they're getting at. So I think talking about concerns or difficulties in an open but respectful way is kind of at the heart of good practice. So in those recordings I was talking about, we developed a measure of good authority, and good authority was the thing that was most strongly associated with positive outcomes for families, and it included 3 elements: purposefulness, so a sense that we were clear what the point of the interview was, a clarity about concerns, so people knew why you were having this conversation, and a focus on the child, bringing the child into the conversation. So whether you call it therapeutic or whether you just call it good rights-focused social work, I think it's at the heart of what children's social care needs to be doing. Who would want to meet a social worker and not know why they were talking to you? That would be terrible.
So Donald, I haven't had a chance to read your book, and
it's okay. It's only just come out. I'm sure you've got it.
You know,
on order,
I mean, I defo will. Well, I'll get Kim's copy off him anyway. I just want to just ask that question. This rights, you know, versus whatever debate's gone forever. You know, I remember having my children's rights sort of handbooks. You know, the child rights kind of approach and the welfare approach, all of this. In where you're coming from, where you know where did the rights emerge from? You know, where are they founded in the law, or is it something more than the law?
It is something more than the law. So the law provides a crucial framework, but the law is something that is then made manifest through policies, resources, and everyday practices. So I have in the book one chapter where there's an argument which I had with my manager about £10 for a family. This is through Section 17 payment. So there's a law that says you can provide money for families, but we social workers every day all across the country and social workers as managers are making a reality of that law. So Section 17 exists in theory. The actual practice of it is something we create through our everyday work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think the thing about the process is really important, because I mean, this is what you're doing, Isabelle, isn't it? Is trying to kind of get the process in terms of the training, the education, all of that reform, so we can actually have a much higher functioning in that space, you know, for social workers, you know. So, you know, and there are really great practice spaces out there, because I don't do as much as Isabelle, but I go out there just because I'm interested where they're touching on the family justice system, and it's really interesting to see what they're creating there in terms of those conversations, you know, with family, with network, with community, you know.
And Josh, were you going to come in?
Yeah, super quickly, just on Beverley's last point there, which is that in a way that's what the early career framework, so sort of setting out the first few years post-qualification for social workers, how, like, teaching them how to achieve the things that are in the national framework. So if they're the outcomes, how do we help people achieve them as quickly as possible? Because we do still leave social workers far too much post-qualification to a kind of discovery process of trial and error, getting it wrong enough times to know how to get it right, and that isn't fair, especially not in the child protection arena. It's not fair for families either. So that hardwiring and alignment of, and I would include inspection in that, with this new set of outcomes is critical.
Yeah. And I mean, I know we're running out of time, but for this sort of work, there's nothing more important than reflective spaces, places that social workers can really think through these difficult decisions. And so we need to create organizations that support thoughtful, wise practice.
Thank you so much. And
it's been a £12 billion question for all these years.
Yeah, no, it's not easy.
That's another one.
I think things are improving, but I you know.
Well,
I know we'd love to go on, isn't it?
No, I know this is. I mean, you know, this is actually the first of these kind of webinars we've done. So it feels like a part 2 where we freestyle, let the 4 of you debate. extremely interesting. So whether we can pull that off or not, but we might make that sincere request.
I'd love that, because I'd love to get with
Yeah.
Isabelle around the States. I think we'll have a really good chat, Isabelle, about that, because my instinct is yours, you know.
But for now, we really appreciate everybody for joining. We had 150 people on the call. Sorry we didn't get all to all of the questions, but we really appreciate all of those contributions. And Rich, we've got a series of webinars this year, haven't we? The next one, we've got New Beginnings and Love Barrow, and also Professor Gateskill wrote the book in small groups. She's really interesting contributions around how you develop community co-design and community responses to child protection. So do join us for that one in July. We'll be working behind the scenes on establishing a part 2 to this conversation. Let's see if we can pull that off. But Rich, did you have a final comment?
Yeah, just a couple of final points. One is to go and buy Donald Forrester's book. I genuinely recommend it highly enough.
Have you got shares in it, Rich? It's giving you a piece, isn't it? Yeah.
But it is really readable and it's really engaging. And as a social worker, it was so refreshing and inspiring to read. So I checked that out. And then the second point is, you're welcome, is we've been talking a lot about like high level social work and what's the point, but I think at an individual level it's to not underestimate the power of like the way in which you interact and the way that you speak to a parent and the way that you deal with a difficult conversation. There is sometimes an idea like there's a system out there that we're somehow not part of. But each and every time that we act within the social work system, we are in that moment kind of defining what the system is. And so if you want a system that's caring and compassionate and thoughtful and kind, then we have the opportunity to do that. So I just wanted to
be that, can't we? We can be those people, you know, we can be those people in how we are with people, you know, that's what we're aiming for. And then we'll get to those, we won't get to those outcomes without that process, without that way of working. We won't get to those outcomes that we're looking for, you know. Yeah, because
thank you everyone for
trusting us, you know.
Thank you everyone.
See you all again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.